It's time for Positively Kansas. Coming up, a trip that started in Wakeeny, Kansas leads to a nationwide mystery. See if you recognize any of the people and places shown in these photos. Also, a Gold Star mother remembers her hero son and explains why she never wants to forget him or his life of service and sacrifice. Plus, we'll go for a ride in one of the rarest cars in the world, built 100 years ago in Wichita. Learn the story of the long-forgotten Jones 6 automobile. And in our Kansas Wild Edge report, Mike Blair shows you how you and your child or grandchild can share a memorable outdoor vacation without ever leaving the state. I'm Sierra Scott. We'll have those stories and more in this edition of Positively Kansas.
Positively Kansas is brought to you in part by...
Before investing your hard-earned money, make sure your financial advisor understands your objectives. Mark Douglas, CFP, serving our community for over 20 years, providing customized financial solutions that focus on the individual.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas serves more than 930,000 Kansans in various programs. Independent, member-owned. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas, an independent licensee of Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association, supports KPTS.
Program support provided by the F. Price Kosman Memorial Trust, Entrust Bank trustee, bringing you the Kansas Wild Edge segments on Positively Kansas.
A box hidden away for decades yields clues to a time that is long past and countless mysteries that beg to be solved. The story begins with a trip that embarked from Wakeeny, Kansas to parts unknown and left behind a fascinating trail of photographs. Jim Grayway reports.
They are moments frozen in time, and they contain history living that day with such particularity, so many details.
Whether it's the boys at the barber shop, the guys and gals at the soda fountain, or any of these other faces and places, photographs are a window to the past.
It's so richly preserved in those pictures, and almost nowhere else, this kind of stuff. The interiors of drugstores, the products on sale, the advertising, the women's fashions, and all the men in suits and loud ties. No, it's living history.
Charlie Custer marvels at this collection of pictures his father took in 1950.
The dress was so much more formal. Everyone. Just lots of things like that. So very exotic and yet at the same time so familiar and so extraordinarily American.
Taken, he believes, at stops along the iconic Route 66 highway, these photos say so much, yet leave so many questions unanswered.
Very often they spark your imagination. You wonder about relationships, you see what some people are thinking.
Who are these people? Well, in most cases, if not all, we'll never know. These children would now be in their 70s. This vibrant, strapping 20-something would now be in his 90s. Everybody else, forget about it. They're long gone, and for the most part, probably long forgotten. These photos are all that's left.
I think they're just extraordinary documentation of a life that just doesn't exist anymore.
We do know about these two, though. In 1950, Charles and Irene Custer were married at Charles' parents' home in Wakeeny, Kansas. From there, Charles packed up his big Agfa-Box camera, and the newlyweds embarked upon a working honeymoon. Charles using the skills he had recently learned from a street photographer in Topeka.
My parents would find a small town, storming into each storefront, saying, "Hollywood's calling, ma'am, your back's pretty, but your face is prettier. Smile for the cameras, newspapers want to know." And they'd shoot one shot, that's all they got. They would then go back to their motel. They'd have, let's say, 30 of these pictures or more every day. And They would develop them in the bathroom sink that night. And then they'd just go back down the main street the next morning and say, well, the newspaper didn't want these pictures, but they're so nice, we thought you folks might like a few copies for your employees and friends. And they would sell them for, I think, $1 a piece. And they would take orders, make contact prints for each store that wanted them, and return a third morning, pass them out, collect their money, and drive on to the next town.
The Custers had not bothered to keep track of who was in any of the photos or where they were taken. The pictures didn't seem to be of any value once the couple had moved on to the next town. Finally, after 2 years of traveling and taking photos, the Custers decided to settle down in Chicago and raise a family. Charles became a lawyer, and he and Irene also opened a TV sales and repair shop.
And of all those photographs, my dad randomly set aside one box of negatives, thinking, someone might find it interesting someday. And my wife pulled it out of the closet as we were packing him out of the family home where we lived, where they had stayed for the past 47 years. And he said, well, sure, if you want that, take it. And friends of ours saw that on my bookshelf years later out here in California. And they are very serious photographers. They were thrilled to see ancient history, and they are responsible for bringing all these pictures back to life.
Those friends have posted all the photos online and are hoping that people can identify some of these faces and places. After 70 years, it may be a long shot, but wait much longer and there probably won't be anybody left who has any idea, though the photos do offer some clues.
Here and there were calendars in the background that gave the name of a town, that sort of thing. So I was able to put together, clearly they were in Oklahoma and New Mexico anyway, and apparently Arizona too. And that's Old 66.
The famous old road has long been eclipsed by interstate highways, now as obsolete as this washing machine.
What a different world.
Irene passed away in 2011, Charles in 2020. As time marches on around us, in these pictures, it's frozen forever in 1950. The faces and places may remain a mystery, but the ways of life from that time are much less mysterious thanks to these remarkable windows to history. For Positively Kansas, I'm Jim Grayway.
You can get a close-up look at each one of the photos by going to this website listed on the screen. okmorephotos.com/backtothepast. If you're not able to catch all that, we also have the link posted on the Positively Kansas Facebook page. Whether it's Memorial Day, Independence Day, or Veterans Day, there are important times to pause and think of those who gave their lives serving our country. A Wichita Gold Star mother tells Chris Frank the pain of losing her son never goes away. And what's more, she tells us why she doesn't want that pain to fade.
Ask me questions, and I will tell you.
Terry Norgren is proud to explain why a Gold Star banner hangs in the window of her northwest Wichita home. It represents the ultimate sacrifice the Norgren son, Marine Captain Chris Norgren, made while trying to save others.
And he's always had a love for flying.
The Bishop Carroll High School grad's love for flying sprung from a trip to the Kansas Cosmosphere in Hutchinson.
He never stop talking about his first experience at the Cosmosphere.
Chris went to space camp and fell in love with flight.
He just wanted to fly.
Terry says Chris attempted to join the Air Force to fly, but she says he was rejected for his vision and height restrictions, saying at 6 feet 5 inches, he was too tall.
And he was going to find a way to make it happen, and he did.
Rejected by the Air Force, Chris turned to the Marines, seeing that flying search and rescue helicopters was the way he could best serve his country.
And he truly believed in the life of the Marines and what our men and women were doing over there, and to be able to support them.
So Chris joined the Marines, but he still had to wait 9 months before a slot opened for him to get into helicopter school. He used that time serving in Afghanistan.
Especially when he was going over to Afghanistan, he wasn't flying there at the time.
She says Chris was driven to fly aid to people, whether it was fellow Marines in combat or civilians suffering from a disaster.
And then the earthquake happened.
That was the massive earthquake in Nepal, April 25th, 2015, which with its follow-up earthquakes killed nearly 9,000 and injured 22,000. The needs were great. That's why the U.S. sent in Marines, including 31-year-old Chris Norgren, to aid in the rescues. It made Terry nervous, to which Chris replied,
Mom, don't worry about it. This is what I signed up to do. This is what I want to do. This is what's important to me. We're going to be fine.
Captain Norgren was doing search and rescue in the mountains on May 12th. It was the same day a major aftershock measuring 7.3 occurred. As Norgren's helicopter climbed to get out of the valley, trouble arose.
A meteorological event is how they defined it. They were surrounded with what they call a cat cloud, which completely blocked their vision, and they were 300 feet from clearing the top of the mountain when they crashed into it.
All 13 on board were killed, 6 Marines, 2 Nepali soldiers, and 5 earthquake victims.
They just didn't make it.
Terry reminds us a family also serves when their loved one serves in the military.
And that's a lot of times what families don't understand, or maybe the general public don't. They see our men and women are going over there and serving the country, but they're not the only ones that are serving the country. The family is too. The husbands, the wives, the sisters, the brothers, they're all very much a part of that. They're supporting our loved ones that are going over there.
Terry says she doesn't want anyone, especially those who knew Chris, to be afraid to ask her questions about his death.
If they know him, and he says, I want to know those memories. I want to hear those stories. I want to keep them alive.
Terry Norgren says helping local veterans is a way to honor her son.
That's what I've chosen to do.
She's part of the Wear Blue group, a running group which honors veterans. She encourages other Gold Star moms to find ways to honor their loved one's sacrifice.
We remember, we pray for them, we say their names.
Terry says she's learning how to handle the pain.
All we can do is just take one day, one step at a time, and just try and get through it and just breathe through it. And I'm now 4 years later, I'm still doing that. I'm at a better place than what I was. The pain's still there. It doesn't ever go away, and I know it won't. I don't want it to. He did a lot to be able to honor and serve our country. I want to do the same thing. I don't want his name ever forgotten.
And so we remember Captain Chris Norgren and his family. For Positively Kansas, this is Chris Frank.
Drivers in West Wichita may recognize his name. The interchange at I-235 and Central Avenue was renamed after Captain Chris Norgren to honor him. Before Wichita took flight as the air capital of the world, it was blazing a trail in the auto industry. J.J. Jones was giving Henry Ford a run for his money with a big and powerful car he called the Jones 6. The brand is all but forgotten now, but Jim Grayway tracked down the only person in Wichita who still has one and drives it. And he learned all about this nearly forgotten piece of Wichita history.
The tank is full of gasoline, I've bought a quart of oil.
Imagine the year is 1919. If you were the one behind the wheel, you'd be the bee's knees, because you'd be driving a car that was the cat's pajamas.
Johnny O'Connor bought an automobile. He took his sweetheart for a ride one Sunday.
The Jones 6 was a humdinger of an automobile back in the day. You'd see a lot of them on the streets of Wichita because this is where they were built. But now, 100 years later, there's only one still rumbling along the city streets. And it's owned by Phil Knighton.
Out here, a let's say 14 Model T Ford four-cylinder would go 35 miles an hour. But we had long, straight stretches of road, and you could go faster. So the six-cylinder car, this would go 60 miles an hour.
Powerful and comfortable for the time, the Jones 6 cars started rolling out of the factory in North Wichita in 1914. Autos were an exciting new thing, and the Jones Auto Company was the talk of the town. Makes sense if you ask history prof. Jay Price.
In the turn of the century, the automobile is sort of this miracle magic alternative. And there is a cultural shift that's taking place. And so Jones is very much tapping into this.
So the Iron Monster, cheered and jeered, loved and despised, cut a swath across rural America. And the rural America of trackless plains, impassable roads, and isolated farms was never again the same.
But this was not uncommon for cities across the country to have small upstart auto companies.
America Online introduces new version 4.0.
Similar to the dot-com boom at the end of the century, the automobile boom at the beginning of the century inspired entrepreneurs everywhere to jump on the bandwagon.
Back in 1916, cars came in every conceivable shape and size. There were 140 different U.S. manufacturers then.
By the time Jones was building cars in Wichita, the Smith Automobile Company in Topeka had already come and gone. So had the Clawfley Automobile Company in Cherry Vale and the Sellers Motor Car Company in Hutchinson.
Industries always start small and local. They start with individuals tinkering with ideas, and then they form small companies, and then those companies grow, and eventually there's a culling, and rival companies get taken out, and then the ones that remain continue to grow and expand and so forth.
Jones was by far Kansas's most successful car company, at one point operating around the clock with hundreds of workers turning out 25 cars a week.
It's just part of the Wichita story. You look at Pizza Hut, you look at various other companies, Coleman, that produced here. They just had that spirit of entrepreneurship, and Jones was right in there.
Knighton not only owns the only Jones 6 on Wichita streets, but as a young car buff in the 1960s, he wrote the definitive history of the company when he was a young college student at Wichita State.
I started doing research for my paper and found nothing. Nothing in the public library, nothing in the university's library.
But he was able to track down one of the company's last living employees. Carl Evans was in his 80s at that time, having built and raced cars back in those early days.
He said, "Come on over and I'll tell you," because I was his right-hand man through the whole project. And he told the whole Jones story.
And that was a story of high hopes. In 1914, Knighton says a Jones 6 was a bargain compared to a cheap little Ford Model T.
Basically, for $195 more, you got a car that goes 60 miles an hour, was much bigger, more powerful, more comfortable, and that was his appeal. But the guns of August changed all of that.
World War I threw a wrench into everything for companies like Jones that purchased most of their parts from other manufacturers.
The components were suddenly in demand. We were selling to the Germans, we were selling to the British, we were selling to the French and the other belligerents in World War I before we got involved. And the competition for these components for military trucks and vehicles were so similar to what was going into assembled cars like the Jones. The price tripled.
Then, to add insult to injury, a massive fire destroyed the Jones factory in 1920. Even before the embers cooled, the rebuilding effort was underway, but by the time the factory was rebuilt, the company was deep in debt and went bankrupt. After turning out 3,000 high-quality cars, the whole thing was kaput. Dr. Price says even without the fire, the Jones Company was facing a very bumpy road ahead.
I think there were a lot of factors that worked against Jones.
Price says the larger automobile makers like Ford squeezed out the small upstarts with their ability to build lots of cars more efficiently. Meanwhile, the big boys also had the resources to advertise and distribute nationwide and develop new technology as customers started demanding more. It was some 30 years after doing the research that Knighton came across a man from Texas who owned this Jones 6.
He says, "Oh, you're from Wichita," looking at my business card. I've got a car that was built in Wichita and I'd like to get rid of it. Well, I about had a heart attack right there.
Knighton bought it, spiffed it up, and got it running. This 1919 model is one of only 8 Jones automobiles known to exist in the world. There is one that doesn't run inside the Sedgwick County Historical Museum, but this is the only Jones 6 you'll see cruising along the streets of the city where it was built 100 years ago. Nobody then could have imagined the twists and turns of the road ahead.
Make a car open, make a car clean, no matter how you are far. In daylight or twilight, in starlight or skylight all on. Take a car.
Phil Knighton says he knows a man in Tennessee who owns 4 perfectly preserved Jones 6s. And that man, he says, would like to donate those cars to the city of Wichita on the condition that the city put them on permanent public display. We'll let you know what happens. In Wichita, I'm Jim Grayway for Positively Kansas.
In case you're wondering, the Jones Car Factory was located along 37th Street North, where the Coleman Company sits now. Back in the day, Clyde Cessna rented part of the Jones factory. That's where he started building airplanes as the cars were coming off the assembly line. One thing that hasn't changed much over the past century is fishing. It's still done with a line, a hook, some bait, and lots of patience. In this week's Kansas Wild Edge Report, Mike Blair shows us how he shared this timeless pastime with his grandson on a recent trip.
School starts next week, and it was time for a little road trip fun.
We're going to eastern Kansas today.
So my grandson and I headed out before summer was gone. We hit the road, stopping along the way to pick up some special tackle and lures for where we were going. Bo decided to save up some energy on the 2-hour drive to our first stop. Rock Springs Ranch, where big trout greet you in a spring-fed stream with an old grist mill. You can't fish there, but it gets you in the mood. Festus, that's what I call him, shot some film and then fed the fish.
Oh, I touched him.
Oh, you did?
Whoa.
We got a dose of fishing fever before heading to our next stop at Junction City, Milford Nature Center. While there, we hit the butterfly house. This special habitat keeps live butterflies and other insects on food plants where you can watch them develop. Swallowtails and fritillaries and monarchs were feeding. Then we checked the raptor exhibits where we filmed hawks and buzzards. But that was just a warm-up for Festus's favorite thing, fishing. We went to nearby Milford Reservoir and got into some great catching. We caught lots of catfish and some other species as well. Sometimes we used lures like a mep spinner, catching channel cats and drum in the clear water. We also used bait, venison chunks on a hook. Bottom-feeding catfish couldn't resist. They were hungry, but Festus had some mojo as well.
This is one heck of a fishing hat.
Our lures attracted game fish.
That's a big old wiper.
And in a heat index of 100 degrees, we worked up a sweat. But that didn't matter.
I like fishing. It doesn't make any difference if it's hot or cold.
So we kept having fun until the sun went down, catching more than 50 fish in just a few hours. And then we drove on to nearby Manhattan, where we spent the night. Next morning after pancakes, we drove to a small fishing lake known for its good bass and bluegill fishing. We hoped to catch big bluegills on worms under bobbers. But to our surprise, the fish didn't cooperate. We caught a few tinies, some big golden shiners, and a few small sunfish. But no bass and certainly no big bluegills. So after several hours, we headed on to Tuttle Creek Reservoir. There, we toured the shady campgrounds of Tuttle Creek State Park for fun and scouted the river pond for possible blue cat fishing. But instead, we drove on to another small and beautiful state lake near Manhattan. Its water was clear and deep, so we set up for an afternoon of fishing. Festus caught small bluegills, some green sunfish, and also some beautiful long-eared sunfish. Then he tied on a Ned rig and did some spin fishing. That yielded a nice bass, his best fish of the day. We enjoyed the calm afternoon with no bugs as big thunderheads billed in the distance. It was time to load up, leave the beautiful surroundings, and head back home. But we'd never forget the fun of a summer fishing road trip between two buddies. I'm Mike Blair for Positively Kansas.
Well, that's a wrap for this week. If you have a question, a comment, or a story idea, send us an email at positivelykansas@kpts.org. You can also join the Positively Kansas Facebook page and participate there, too. Until next time, I'm Sierra Scott. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.
Program support provided by the F. Price Kosman Memorial Trust, Entrust Bank Trustee, bringing you the Kansas Wild Edge segments on Positively Kansas.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas serves more than 930,000 Kansans in various programs. Independent, member-owned. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas, an independent licensee of Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association, supports KPTS.
Before investing your hard-earned money, make sure your financial advisor understands your objectives. Mark Douglas, CFP, serving our community for over 20 years, providing customized financial solutions that focus on the individual.